Okay, so I've switched on recording, so we'll kick off the call proper. Let me also share my screen, which I've done. Okay, right. So this week, as you can see, the main theme of the call will just be to share some sort of thoughts, sort of highlights from the meeting, IETF 120 meeting last week. It was fabulous being in Canada. I must admit, it was only when I got home yesterday afternoon I realised the difference in when it gets dark, because it was staying sort of daylight till quite late, I think, in Vancouver and certainly in Banff, and then it was getting dark about sort of 9 p.m. or definitely not dark necessarily, but certainly the light had faded quite a lot at 9 p.m. at home yesterday, which felt really early in comparison. But anyway, well, we'll talk about some of the highlights from Vancouver, and then, time permitting, pick up on sort of recent sort of developments in the news and other stuff as appropriate. And as so, given a fair number of us that are on this call were at the meeting, feel free to sort of chip in as we go along with your observations. So I've deliberately not put in sort of loads of mine, so enable others to contribute. Just scanning down the list of people that are on the call. There's a good number on the call that were also present in Vancouver. And a particular welcome, obviously you're all very welcome, but see, Jeff, you managed to make it onto the call, so welcome as well, or you were on there momentarily. I hope I haven't thrown you off. Well, Jeff Houston was on the call. Not sure what time of day it is for him. If he may rejoin again, but we'll see if he does or not. Okay, so let's just walk through some of the agenda, as I say, from last week. I'll call out a few things that I thought were interesting, but others feel free to interrupt me as we go along with your observations as well. Because there are an awful lot of sessions, and I definitely wasn't at all of them. Okay, so just casting our minds back just over a week ago to last Sunday, the 21st, the Internet Engineering and Planning Group, IPG, took place as it sort of traditionally does on the Sunday morning, covered a broad range of topics in the 2-hour slot. So some of the interesting ones, I thought there was some discussion on sustainability from an operational perspective, which was, I think, picked up in the green BOF later in the week, but I wasn't in the green BOF, so if anybody else was there, you can comment on that when we get to it. Nalani Elkins and a co-presenter talked about IPv6 over Bluetooth. The main use case they envisaged was sort of disaster recovery, but anyway, it was an interesting sort of presentation, kicked off a bit of a fun discussion on that, and in a similar theme about doing IP in sort of more challenging environments. Mark Blanchet talked about IP in deep space and some of the challenges there. Specifically talking about doing IP connection between Earth and Mars, and the fact you might have potentially an interruption in service of 2 weeks because of the sun being in the way between the two planets for 2 weeks. So I think once every year or 2 years or something. So some unique sort of differences versus in-planet IP, but I came away thinking he felt quite confident that was doable, and also Peter Thomason sort of touched on post-quantum in DNS-sec. There was some other stuff, but those were the main things that I took away from that. Generally interesting. They were all quite punchy presentations. So if any of those are of interest, I'll put links to the recording along with links to this call. So that's definitely, from an operational point of view, there's that's a sort of content-rich 2 hours worth of stuff that you may wish to dip into if you didn't make that meeting. I'll let anyone else comment if you happen to be there and wanted to say anything specific before I move on. See, welcome back, Jeff. Hope the link holds up, depending on what time zone you're in. Hopefully not Canberra, because that would be fairly horrible. It looks like quite an issue.
No, I'm on a mobile in California, so it's intermittent.
Oh, okay. That's slightly more civilized time of day than it would have been in Canberra.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, feel free, same to everybody else. I'll just walk through some things that caught my eye through the agenda over the week. Feel free, you and anybody else, to jump in with anything that either you think I've missed or that you want to add as we go through the week.
Sure.
Okay, moving on to the Monday. You'll see on the left-hand side of the slide, as we did with the agenda preview, I put the sort of the actual agenda from for the meeting on the left, just as an aid memoir. On the right, those are some of the things that were touched on in the two highlighted sessions. So towards the top of the screen, the IETF-wide dispatch session, and lower down the DELEG meeting. With regards to dispatch, you may recall that that was an experiment that was begun in Brisbane at the last meeting, continued through to this meeting. I think the intent was by the ISG to run it over the two meetings, review, and then decide whether to continue or not. My sense was they'd learned a lot from the sort of first iteration in Brisbane, and the chairs of the session were much tighter in being clear with people that came with content to keep it relatively short. So I think 5 slides was, and I think there's a 15-minute slot, if I remember rightly, per topic. So we didn't have the 42 slides that someone came with to Brisbane, which is a good thing. And they tried to ensure, within reason, that people that came to the mic focused on the dispatch question, i.e. whether this was a topic worthy of discussion within the IETF, and if so, where. I've put on the slide, top right corner, not all, but that's the majority of the things that were sort of touched on. In that discussion, as I say, I think the format was, the refinements to the format made it more successful this time round. So hopefully, in my view, the format's retained going forward. It's far more time efficient than having a handful of different dispatch sessions sprinkled through the week, and it gives rather more scrutiny to the topics and the decisions. I've pulled out some of the more administrative things because they were more interesting to me that were discussed. As a proposal from Mary Nodal on making sure that there's some gender representation on the non-com each year, which, as may be anticipated with the ITF community, did trigger some debate. It wasn't too bad, but there's a couple of slightly less helpful contributions from the mic queue, in my view. Also, some discussion on how to administer sort of list management procedures, which is quite useful. And apologies for some of the formatting. I'm just going to catch my eye on the side. I typed that up post call. So Elliot sort of talked about some of the list management sort and ombuds team, so moderation and ombuds team type stuff. Adrian brought in a proposal or surfaced a discussion around experiments and the use of experimental RFCs. And then David Ashkenazi sort of brought up the topic of milestones in working groups, and if they're largely meaningless to get rid of them unless they're actually used properly by working group chairs. On the whole, I think, as I say, the format seemed to work okay to me, and covered a reasonable amount of ground in the allotted 2-hour slot. So it felt like a good use of time to get it done, but with a good deal of scrutiny from a couple hundred or so people, rather than whoever turns up to one of the area-specific dispatch sessions. So I thought it went relatively well. I'll pause in case anyone has any different viewpoints on that. And if not, I'll then say, and then in session 2, the session I went to was DELEG. It was all very well behaved, and seemed to be a fair degree of consistency or comfort with the direction that the group is working towards. Not everyone agreed with every last sort of point, so there's I think a further discussion to be had around whether to do DELEG at the zone cut or not, which Willem Taroop from I can't remember where Willem's from. It's one of the Dutch groups anyway, and he's also very active in Right. But anyway, Willem made the point that I know Paul Vixie had brought that issue up on this call when we had the panel discussion around DELEG, so he took that into the working group, which was good. But fairly broad range of topics were covered, sort of DELEG specific topics within the 2 hours, as you can see from the list I've sort of put on there. But as I say, it was done with a very positive spirit overall, which wasn't the case with some of the other topics, which I'll come on to later in the week. So it all felt very, very good humoured, which was good. We didn't get really into the detail of whether DELEG itself was the right answer, whether it was a worthwhile thing to do. And I know some people maybe have different points of view on that. Oh, thank you, Ed. Thank you. NLNet Labs. Yeah, I knew it was Dutch. I just couldn't, for the life of me, my mind went blank as to where Willem was from. Thank you for that in the chat. And yes, and to Kathleen's point, yeah, as I say, yeah, it was a very cordial meeting, I felt. But DELEG, not that I was expecting it wouldn't be, but it was good to see that. As I say, which wasn't necessarily the case. There wasn't so much consensus in some of the groups later in the week. Let me pause there to see if anyone's got anything else, perhaps more substantial, to say either about DELEG or any of the other sessions from those first two on Monday.
I have something here, Andrew, that might be helpful. I think in terms of the DELEG work, there was a pervasive sense of unreality that this work had broad relevance and application and therefore adoption, whereas I think the actual use case and the way in which it would get used, i.e. validating delegation, aliasing on name servers, and there was one other aspect of this. Oh, that's right, the alternative hints and the glue records. That is a small incremental benefit for a huge amount of cost in DNSSEC. And DELEG without DNSSEC is an interesting exercise as a thought exercise, but realistically, the world is very impatient about how quickly answers come back. And DELEG seems the long way around in so many ways that I suspect underneath all this argument about what's a requirement and what isn't, is a real argument about to what extent does this actually resolve real problems in today's DNS in a helpful manner, or is it just an exercise in filling up some time? And to my mind, as you see by these comments, I am a little bit biased about exactly what role this will have in the broader DNS. It is a lot of detail and a lot of extra work, and I'm not sure what the benefit truly is over what we do at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, that's helpful. That's a good illustration, as I say, that maybe not everyone whilst it was a cordial discussion, it doesn't mean to say that everyone was in full agreement with everything that was discussed, but at least it was done in a cordial manner. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that, on Jeff's point, or had any sort of different thoughts to that session. I assume if you don't unmute and say anything that that's not the case. Okay, anyone got anything else to say on any of the other sessions listed from the sort of first two on the Monday? Because if not, I'll move the slide on. That takes us to sort of sessions 3 and 4 on Monday. I sort of went into DNS Ops, which covered a lot of ground, making it really hard to summarise, to be fair. I'm always impressed how, even though DNS Ops is spread over sort of 2 sessions, this one and one later in the week, it seems to get it all done within the allocated time. So it covered a lot of sort of operational DNS topics, but I didn't really come away with anything specific to mention on that. I know we've got at least one of the DNS Ops chairs on the call. Not, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say on that, or indeed anybody else for that matter, on DNS Ops. If so, feel free to jump in. If not, that's fine too. Otherwise, I also dropped in because Glenn had mentioned it on this call a couple of weeks ago to the media ops session, just the back end of that, to hear your sort of presentation on network overlay on impacts on streaming, Glenn, which you duly delivered in that slot. I think this had some relevance also to the Scone Pro meeting, which we'll come to in a couple of slides or so. What was your take on how your presentation was received?
Well, I thought, despite my terrible presentation skills, it was received pretty well. We had some extremely positive engagement from folks in the audience. In fact, nobody said, "Oh, this is nothing. Go away. Stop talking about it." In particular, for this group, since we're all very DNS focused here, there is a Scone Pro intersection, but also one of the things that this network overlays thing highlighted was when these overlays are active, they often redefine your DNS resolver selection. And in fact, can create scenarios where you're having resolvers that you're not quite sure which resolver you're talking to, and may result in situations where you have different resolvers being used in for different protocol contexts, whether it's HTTP traffic or HTTPS traffic, which can make things a little bit interesting to deal with when you're trying to use DNS for things like cache selection and geo stuff. So I think there's also probably an intersection with the side meeting that Ben Schwartz organized around DNS load balancing. So there's a whole bunch of things coming together. So if you haven't looked at this talk, I will apologize up front for my speaking skills, but I do recommend folks go take a look at it, because I think it's going to be new work we're going to take up in the working group.
Yeah, and to sort of preempt some comments I'll make later, there are a couple of different groups where network operations, network management in the context of encrypted traffic, or traffic where the network operator couldn't necessarily see the detail of the traffic, and the fact that maybe cause complications for network management, or indeed network management actions cause complications for that traffic. So it came up in different ways. So it was interesting. So it came up sort of 2 or 3 times through the meeting in different workshops. I suppose it's good that people that are really keen on sort of the whole obscuring all of the traffic from the network operator approach is starting to understand that that does have implications when you put network management into the mix. So I suspect that topic will be revisited again at future meetings.
One other comment about that. One of the issues that it sort of is we're trying to draw out in the overlay thing is that even when you obscure it from the network operator, which that's a philosophical discussion. The other thing we're seeing is it's also obscuring it from the applications. And it's when, in particular, when applications suddenly discover their network, the policies being applied to the network traffic are different than they thought was going to happen. That caused a lot of problem if you're also trying to optimize your applications for both throughput and latency. And so one of the attacks we're sort of saying is like, it would be really nice if there was a mechanism when you change policy like DNS policies to also tell your application that this happened.
Yeah. And that definitely sort of came out, I think, again, in the Scone Pro session in a slightly different way, that the sort of things around the network change, and that causes sort of problems for the application. Yeah, well, as I say, we'll come back to that topic on this call, but I'm sure also within the IETF community over coming meetings as well. Sorry, somebody's raised their hand. Apologies, somebody just noticed. Kathleen, did you want to sort of come in on this or anything else?
Yes, for Scone Pro, I was wondering, just from back when I was an AD, couldn't you use IPPM for the, because they wanted to do it out of band for the assessment. And according to the charter for IPPM, it can work from a client, and you could do it from a client or from, administrative systems. I don't know if anyone on this call would be familiar with that. I did check with a couple of other people. Alvaro thought, yes, that it would be possible.
I'm not familiar enough with it to have an opinion. I don't know if anybody else does, but we'll come back to Scone Pro in a moment.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Me raising it several times, but even though we haven't got to it yet. But okay, well, interesting thought. Well, if anyone else has an opinion on that, maybe come back to that when we sort of touch on Scone Pro in a moment. Okay, just moving through the agenda. In session 4 on Monday, I went to the the PEARG, Privacy Enhancements and Assessments Research Group. I sort of got caught up in another discussion. First, I missed the beginning of that, but caught a presentation on Ariadne, which you evidently don't say it that way if you're French, because I think it was a French presenter who said it somewhat differently, which was interesting in of itself, which was, as the title says, a privacy-preserving network layer protocol. It was an interesting idea. Obviously, being a research group, it was a very early stage, but obviously part of a sort of general direction of travel within the community to look at various privacy-preserving opportunities in different ways. So if privacy preservation is your thing, you may wish to catch up on that presentation. Certainly worth a look. And apologies, I didn't catch the first half of that meeting, so I can't comment on that. I think there were 2 presentations. I can't remember what the other one was, and I didn't see it anyway, so I won't mention that. I don't know if anyone else either caught PARG or anything else at the back end of Monday that warrants a comment. And if it does, just unmute and say something, otherwise I'll move on. Okay, I'll take it as possibly not. Okay, moving on through the week. Okay, Scone Pro was on Tuesday, so that's good. It's come around. So unlike DELEG, the chairs of the BOF went through the draft charter and various other things, and there were evidently quite different views as to what even what the right question was, let alone what the right answer might be, and the direction the any future working group might need to take. Now, I've not been following the mailing list for this group since the first BOF in Brisbane. And it has now, the draft charter has determined that it is only focused on one very specific use case and one goal, which I've put on the slide there, which is it will focus on adaptive bitrate video carried in QUIC. So it's very specific on ABR traffic in QUIC is the problem it's trying to solve in order to improving throughput of that traffic. The rationale for that is video traffic's already, I'm not sure the source of this, but according to the draft charter, 70% of overall traffic volumes, and that's expected to grow to 80% by 2028. So it's a big chunk and growing of internet traffic. And they talk to some particular scenarios which are very problematic, such as if I'm on TikTok and start watching a video and then move on to the next one and then the next one in very quick succession, that causes problems. And if there are changes in the available, the overall available bandwidth on the link I'm using, that can make QUIC very inefficient in its use of that bandwidth. Again, specifically for a video. So that's the problem they determined to solve. I wouldn't say there was uniform agreement even to that as the right thing to focus on within the BOF discussion. There was quite a lot of differences of opinion, it felt like. So I came away from that session thinking I'm not convinced it's going to make it to a working group at that rate. It felt there was less agreement than perhaps there was at the first BOF, was my sense from the discussion.
So Andrew, forgive me, I can't figure out how to push the button to raise my hand with the client I have on Zoom. So I apologize for being rude. So,
That's
as
okay.
you know, video is part of my day job. And I will point out a couple of things about the current proposal as they've put it out there. QUIC does carry video traffic, but it carries video traffic for a subset of the overall video delivery on the internet. In particular, it's very popular for traffic coming from Meta. It's very popular for traffic coming from Alphabet services. It's used much less frequently for traffic coming from big video streamers. In fact, video streamers often do not use QUIC at all because their architectures for their players and their playout infrastructure is built around TCP, and their engineers are all trained around TCP. And so if you're talking like streaming application like a Netflix or a Peacock or a Prime, generally those will be not over QUIC. There's some exceptions. So for instance, if your private relay turned on and the traffic gets redirected up through private relay, that will be over QUIC because it uses mask, and therefore it would fall under the QUIC thing. Although, given the definition here, it wouldn't fall under the Scone Pro BOF because that wouldn't be recognized as video traffic being carried over QUIC. That would be recognized as mask traffic being carried over QUIC. So my point being, this is actually a pretty narrow definition of the amount of traffic. And so when they say like 70% of the traffic, that is definitely not under QUIC. There's a lot of QUIC video traffic to a few providers, but the rest of it is not QUIC based. So when you narrow the scope here, say, well, it's QUIC, that's a big slice of it, it excludes. And then the second part is when you suddenly say it's ABR under QUIC, that's another slice of stuff that's carried under QUIC. And so it very much narrowed the scope. But it's also interesting in that, QUIC is, as was pointed out at the microphones, highly secretive to the network perspective of what it's doing. And here you have a proposal for The client telling the network, hey, I'm doing this thing. Does that violate some privacy rules or privacy expectations? And then you have the network telling the client things to do in a secure way. It's an interesting use case. It's very narrow, and it has a lot of stuff to be worked out in the details of how this would even work. Does it get forward? I think it might make it. It might become a thing. But it would become a thing that, with the current definition, is very narrow in who it would apply to and who would make use of it. And so that
Yeah.
might be a reason not to do it, because it's so narrow to specific use cases for specific operators.
And I should have said, by the way, for anyone that hasn't been following Scone Pro, the intent is that it allows the network operators to signal to an application that there's some limit to the bandwidth stroke throughput capability of the connection. So it may be there's constrained bandwidth over video or satellite, or it may be that perhaps I've got a limit on the available bandwidth on my fiber because I'm mean and I don't pay much. There could be various reasons for the constraint.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're ever going to be constrained over fiber or over broadband. I think this is going to be a use case where you're over a radio network of some sort.
Yeah. The other thing, because although I think this is one of the challenges, because the network won't know if you're carrying sort of ABR video over quick, even though they're saying that's the target or that's the problem they're trying to solve. Obviously, any application could ask for the signal. It doesn't mean to say that they are using that, that they do fit that very narrow use case, but that's, if you like, the aspiration for the working group with the problem that they're trying to solve. And equally, I should have also said, for anyone that's not following it closely, that it'd be entirely voluntary whether the client decides to take any action as a consequence of receiving the signal. So this would be a voluntary action it may choose to take, may choose to ignore if it does get it. But as Glenn said,
I was going to say, I think the proposed workflow is the client would say, hey, network, I'm going to do this. Do you have policies you want to tell me about? And then the network would say, yes, I do. Here they are. And then the client would say, okay, that's fine. I'm going to either do it or I'm going to ignore you. By the way, one of the things when you're looking at these proposals in particular is, clients, especially when you're mobile, can change networks. You can switch from a Wi-Fi network to a cellular network pretty seamlessly these days. And those may have different policies. And so one of the concerns I have with the current proposal is, how does the client know that it's getting the most current policies applied to it? Because very often devices these days have abstracted networks so much that applications are often not told when they've changed the network. So
yes, unless they beacon a signal every, I don't know, X minutes or something, regardless of whether asked. But yeah, you're right. Otherwise, if you don't ask again, the answer you got may be completely irrelevant 10 minutes later.
Yeah, this gets back to the notion that the clients, we've gotten so good at making things simple and unified for the clients that now they're kind of operating in a vague space where they hope they know what's going on, but they're not really sure. They can't prove what's going on. It's these policies that shouldn't under the covers. And so I think Scone Pro is very much related to the network overlays discussion philosophically, definitely not anywhere in the same technology approach but philosophically the same problem of something changed. Let me tell you about it.
Yeah. Okay, let me move on. I didn't have anything that jumped out at me from the Tuesday session 2, so I'll move on unless anyone jumps in. There were various other interesting things. The other one I'm going to highlight, there was a whole series of applied networking research workshops, 4 of them back to back on the Tuesday, which were very good, all of which were co-chaired by Ignacio, who did a fantastic job for doing the whole day's worth of co-chairing. That's quite impressive. The one I wanted to mention was, as you can see, session 4 on Tuesday, which was sort of titled Lightning Papers, which had a couple of interesting papers, one of which including from Sheetal Kumar on centralization, consolidation and fragmentation, which I think made the point that when the term centralization is used, it usually means a sort of technical centralization, consolidation, perhaps more from an economic point of view. So if that topic is of general interest to you, listen to her presentation. There's a lot more to it than that. And then they had a panel which included Jeff Houston, Christian Heitmar and Arno Tedai, plus the two co-chairs. I think it was a great idea, but because of all the other papers in that slot, there was a lot less time available than the co-chairs envisaged for the panel discussion. And I think I suggested to them that they may wish to consider next time round that maybe they have a dedicated panel discussion slot and then perhaps a completely separate session if they have papers as well. I think that would be better, but I think it was a good idea that they did that. It made for an interesting actually, I realise that's not actually that from that one. Sorry, that's not from the ANO one. That's from was it DINRG, I think. Sorry, apologies, I'm sort of mislabeling it. But yeah, it's just that they maybe have two separate slots and just to give proper amount of time to the panel. So it was an interesting panel discussion, but nowhere near enough time for the sort of 3 questions and sub questions that the co-chairs have put together. Since you're on the call, Jeff, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say about either that panel or the topics that they were trying to cover. If your bandwidth's holding up whilst you're
yes, the DNRG chairs have a problem of, people submit, material to present and kind of, do you say no and say we're doing something else or do you accept them? So it was a kind of a meeting in 2 halves. You're perfectly correct. On the panel discussion, there has been this interesting back current ever since the topic was presented to the IETF as to whether the IETF as a standards body can do anything about this. Should we, for example, concentrate on working on protocols that are implicitly promote decentralized deployments, or is centrality so intrinsic to the economic mode of operation that the protocol doesn't matter? The service providers will aggregate and centralize by the very nature of the economic conditions that prevail. And I think this parallels many historical discussions over the last century, at least, on this same topic. And I think as a panel, we were trying to tease out whether this is a condition of our time or a condition of our circumstance. And, I find that topic incredibly interesting, because if you're trying to say this creates social ills and socially worse outcomes, then we really should do something about it. If this is a circumstantial issue, it's a product of our times, grappling with it, even in a regulatory sense, is actually far more challenging. And though some places have got big guns like the Sherman Act, do the big guns work in this kind of situation? And so far, the recent experience with antitrust actions against Microsoft and so on tend to indicate the big guns aren't big enough. And the EU experience of nibbling at the edges seems to be less effectual at the core of the problem than I think they would hope. To my mind, that's a fascinating discussion and well worthy of not just a session, in the IETF, but, an entire one-day workshop somewhere that involves regulators and technologists about the nature of the problem and how we can respond. But that's kind of a teaser as to what we were talking about. And for me, I find it a fascinating area to consider. And there's a lot of perspectives to bring to it. That's about as much as I should say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I thought it was a shame that, as it turned out in the end, there was only half an hour left, because you started to open up what would have been a really rich discussion, but hence I think it could have done with its own dedicated slot. Kathleen, did you want to come in on that?
I did, yes, thank you. So Jeff, I would love to sync with you offline. And the high level is that when I teach a course on security architecture and design at Georgetown, each semester I have an activity where students look at the opposing trends of both centralization and decentralization. And so I've been doing this for a few years now, every semester, and thinking about it more and more. And, I think we do have those economic factors pushing the centralization. And at the same time, when we start up new things in the internet, we begin with decentralization. And I wonder if that's just a more natural progression path, right? Where we have IoT and, it'll start out as decentralized, but we're going to manage it and cull it more and more over time, and then distributed ledgers and other technologies. But looking at it as opposed to, we're moving towards centralization, but that we're doing it in a technology independent way, depending on, its state of maturity, what it looks like in the beginning, the challenges we think we have, and then the ones we wind up with.
Right, as I said, if this is our circumstances, then the regulatory responses are necessarily different than if this is a distortion of the conventional operation of markets. Distortion of markets has a much stronger call for intervention to preserve.
Right.
Well, I'll leave the two of you to maybe pick up that thread.
Motivations differ, yeah. But anyway, yes, it's a discussion for another time. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, you cut out then, Jeff, but I think we got the gist of that. Right, Simon, did you want to come in before I move on?
Just quickly, I would add rhetorically, what is centralization? We're seeing more and more distributed networks that are effectively behaving as centralized networks, but they're distributed, and we're seeing this in telecoms and the internet. So certainly, from a regulatory perspective, I think we are beginning to cope and have to cope with both concepts. We can no longer expect centralization because the technology and the market are moving in both directions, and goodness knows where they're actually going.
Yeah, and I guess things like Quick and Mask, to turn that into protocol discussion, come into play there, in terms of you may have a distributed network, but one or a few players may have a lot of control over that network, even if they don't have ownership of it as such. And as you can see, that's where I meant to. DNRG was actually on the Wednesday, not the Tuesday, just for clarification. Right, I'm conscious of the time. I don't think we're going to get through all of this today, so we may pick some of this discussion up next week. I'll perhaps try and get to the end of Wednesday. And then pause. So we talked about the Wednesday morning, and I urge you to watch the record, the DNRG, so Decentralization of the Internet Research Group, to give it its full name. Definitely watch that if you have the opportunity. It was the beginnings of a really interesting discussion.
The trumpet stays down over months.
Not sure Jeff meant to come in then. I'll just mute that. So it was the beginnings of a really interesting discussion. And I can see Glenn's posted, in the chat, the link to some, by the look of the information on how much is traffic is video. Okay, so in addition to that, I went to the RASP, so the Research and Analysis of Standard Setting Processes Research Group, which is no longer a proposed research group. It's now been accepted by the IETF as a sort of formalised as an actual research group. And again, of the various presentations within that, presentation on Activity Pub, a non-standard standard, and they sort of talked through the presentation, sort of covered how that Activity Pub and some related standards came into being through the STO, and how it's quite a traumatic process for the people behind that set of standards, because of the culture that they were dealing with, which wasn't in the IETF, just for clarity. So I personally found that interesting, and also I did catch the sort of part of the TLS working group. There was a lot of discussion about formal analysis of some of the cryptographic methods, and a lot of negativity about the proposed way that the chairs are put forward to undertaking that analysis, and by whom, and whether it should be anonymous or not. And I think a realization that probably the people that did the analysis ought to be covered by the IETF note well, but as far as I could tell thus far haven't been, which can cause some issues around IPR, etc. So yeah, and it posed a few questions about some of the culture into the degree of hostility of feedback that people can get, which was sort of touched on in that discussion. So quite interesting in of itself for some of us. There was a whole series of more sort of actual normal working group business that was covered as well, which I've not mentioned in the interest of brevity, but there's a good degree of other material that they covered, which is worth catching up on, which I'll maybe mention later on. And then finally, I'll just probably wrap up here. On the Wednesday, session 3, I went to the HRPC Human Rights Protocol Considerations Group. And they had 2 presentations. It was a slightly strange working group or research group because both of the co-chairs were remote. Only one of them really participated actively in the meeting. And so the meeting itself was really just 2 presentations, each of 25 minutes or so. One about democracy on, not just around the internet, and another one on designing networking technology for value outcomes. Both really interesting presentations, but it was a bit odd having a research group with neither co-chair in the room, and they hadn't asked a proxy to be in the room on their behalves either. So it was like, whereas both presenters were in the room, conversely. Does anyone else want to jump in with anything else that you sort of went into through to end of Wednesday? And if so, just unmute and speak. And if not, I'm going to pause there because I won't get through the remainder in the remaining 7 minutes, and I will just quickly ignore this. I'll jump through these very briefly. So to come back on, actually it'd probably be more efficient if I change the format. So I'll come back to this and just quickly highlight a couple of things. Sorry, press the right button. From the sort of headlines and so on in the week that's worth you looking at in the remaining 7 minutes. So unsurprisingly, in the email you would have received early today from me, if you're on the headlines mailing list, and if you're not, drop me a message and I'll add you to it. There's a fair amount about CrowdStrike, so that's obviously worth a look, particularly for those of you that were affected in your travel in getting to the IETF meeting. And dare I say it, there's a number of really interesting things on the AP Nick blog over the last week or so, as there always is, I should hastily say, as Jeff is on the call, including there was a post about DNS and UDP truncation, so that's definitely worth a look. And privacy and the DNS client subnet. So two separate articles from Jeff, and a piece on NIS2 and who is. We've sort of touched on NIS2 previously, and we'll be coming back to it with Michael in a few calls' time. But in the meantime, others are as well this time, as they specifically looking at ICANN's who is policies in the context of Article 28 of NIS2. I'll jump over most of the rest of this. There's also a second of a 2-part discussion on the APNIC podcast of DNSSEC and calling time on DNSSEC, which I know we've discussed on here sort of previously as well. So plenty of stuff on APNIC, even more than normal this week, which is worth your time. As I say, I won't go through everything else because we don't have time. So I'll skip over all of this. You can catch up with it at your leisure post-call. I will also call out, we've got a few looming deadlines. So if you wanted to have a remote hub for the forthcoming IGF meeting at the end of the year in December, you've got till tomorrow to apply. This is for remote as opposed to an on-site hub in the IGF virtual village. Also, if you wanted to apply for funding from the RIPE Community Projects Fund, you've got till the end of this month. And then the other one that's looming is the AIB have got a proposed workshop on AI control, and they've got a call for papers. And if you want to submit a paper, you've got till the 2nd of August to submit a paper. There's more details about the proposed workshop on the URL that's up. Oh, did I say AIB? Apologies. Yes. I do indeed. Yes, thank you for that, Glenn. Yeah, IAB, not AIB. That's an insurance company. I'm sure they do good things, but not necessarily related to AI control. So those are all sort of coming up over the next few days. So just bear that in mind if any of those are of interest to you. And then there's not too many events through August. Other than the very back end of August, sort of first week of September, really, you got APNIC 58 in New Zealand, and then at the end of September you got the ICANN DNS Symposium Week in Santa Marta in Colombia coming up. So if you're planning to go to that, then think about registration and sorting out travel and so on quite soon, as it's not so far away. And then next week, originally I sort of had a brief discussion with Peter Lowe about doing a 2-part DNS abuse session, but we might, I think Pete's going to be traveling, as it turns out, next week. So I think we'll maybe continue with the IETF 120 highlights next week. So Peter will cover the DNS abuse on the 19th of August, as you can see. So we've got various things lined up through this month. I won't go through all of those, but plenty of stuff. And if there's anything you want to add to the schedule, again, just get in touch with me directly and I'll be happy to do that. And with 2 minutes to spare, I'll stop there. Apologies for sort of talking do a lot of talking on the call this week, but let me just stop and say in the remaining 2 minutes, if there's anything else that anyone wants to mention, either in connection with the IETF meeting or indeed anything else that is on your mind currently. And if you do, either pop it in the chat or just unmute and speak if that's easier. See anyone? So anyone's typing. No one's unmuted, so I'll assume not. So okay, well, we will revisit this next week, just to call out a few other sort of points of interest from the IETF meeting, which there was a fair amount this time. It was a good meeting. But in the meantime, I hope those of you that went are all sort of recovered or recovering from your travels, getting back home, and have a fantastic week, everyone, and look forward to catching up again next Monday. So talk to you all then. Bye all.
Bye all.